Everybody I've met through the APBA community has been just a real connection. I mean, it's just really, I use this term decades ago. It's a brotherhood. There's a sweet innocence about rolling dice across the table from somebody, and you want to win, but you're having a great time and you're laughing. It's just such a joyous thing to share for years after year after year. Again, so many tender connections of such good people. Again, whether it's conventions or, God, at card shows, you'd meet people who were looking for APBA cards or just baseball cards. You'd mention APBA, and you'd be all of a sudden talking to your best friend about the game. It's just such a sweetness. People bring their A game to APBA, whatever it is, organizationally, electronically, um, socially, or like Pete Samelli organizing things for decades. Keep rolling, guys. Thank you very much. Bless you all.
Those were the wise and wonderful words of the wise and wonderful Edwin Zack, true APBA legend, true APBA icon, and really a great friend and cheerleader for the entire tabletop sports gaming community. He wrote one of the most important books in the hobby of stats-based baseball, the handbook for APBA baseball cards, issued as a first edition in 1992, and the 1999 second edition titled The Ultimate Handbook for APBA Baseball Cards. Unfortunately, after a long illness, Mr. Zack has passed. We learned of his passing from Ed's longtime friend and collaborator, Dan Armstrong, who actually taught Edwin the game of APBA baseball. Now, I asked Mr. Zack prior to our April 1st tournament at the Baseball Hall of Fame if he would be willing and able to address the folks who attended that inaugural event, the first cards and dice tournament held at the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. And despite his illness, Mr. Zack enthusiastically agreed, and it was a really important moment for folks. That wasn't the first time I talked to Ed, actually. I'd never met the man personally, but back when I was starting the APBA Football Club and using the name of APBA Football to reach out across the entirety of the APBA community, I reached out not only to Ed but to Dan Armstrong, and I'll read you some excerpts from my still unpublished interview with Dan Armstrong about how he and Edwin met in Oregon. And then I'll read you the article that I wrote in May of 2012 summarizing my interview with Edwin Zack. And, it's really one of the most important resources. And fortunately, that Zack handbook lives on in digital form. I will share a video of John Cochran, who is the current editor of the project, announcing at the Lancaster Convention in 2012, which was a fan-held event, that the Zack handbook would be digitized and appear online, and so it has and continues to this day at zackapahandbook.org. And work continues apace. It's a never-ending project. And on the face of it, it's simply one book documenting one game. But it's really so much more than that. It's one of the most passionate passion projects you'll ever come across. If you are a fan of highly detailed tomes, this is a book worthy of your reverence. And if you can find a print copy, and many still exist, albeit the prices are sometimes quite high, for good reason, given the rarity, you'll be amazed at not only how Edwin and his collaborators tied decades of baseball history to this particular game, but how they so enthusiastically and comprehensively documented typography and functionality of the cards, not just the regular issues, but the reprints, the great teams of the past, sample cards. It's exhaustive and in the best possible way. Fortunately, thanks to John Cochran and all his collaborators, you can still read the APBA Baseball Handbook at zackapahandbook.org. So in 2012, I had interviewed Ed. We spoke for about 30 minutes while he was building a church in Oregon. And as is my wont as a journalist, I tracked him down, and I believe he was on a ladder at the time and came down to talk a little bit, completely out of the blue. And I'll just read you this article that I had published originally on our Facebook page. This is what Edwin Zack told us in May 2012, the 20th anniversary of the first edition handbook for APBA baseball cards. Edwin Zack. To longtime APBA aficionados, the name is synonymous with a level of devotion and a quantity of documentation perhaps unmatched by any other board game. It's been 20 years since he published the first edition of his exhaustive The Ultimate Handbook for APBA Baseball Cards. With prices for the book skyrocketing, one copy of the second edition sold for $377 on eBay in an auction that ended March 19th, and another copy signed by the man himself was being offered for $349.95 at the time of this writing. It's clear the book still resonates deeply with the APBA community. The work is a testament not only to one man's fascination with a unique product that inspires a sometimes fanatical passion among us devotees, it stands as a significant accomplishment in a life filled with extraordinary achievements. When I phoned Zack to discuss the book, which I confess I hadn't known existed until APBA Hall of Famer Pete Simonelli told me about it, he was as thrilled to speak about APBA as I was to talk with him. "You just hit the right button," he enthused toward the end of our 30-minute conversation. "For whatever reason, I'm connecting to something that's really joyful and fun for me." For those who don't keep in touch with Zack, a retired contractor, he has spent the past 2 years building a church in Eugene, Oregon. His evident joy in reconnecting with a game that has provided abundant pleasure and a wealth of powerful tales speaks to the near-religious devotion to the mystery of the APBA cards. The timing of our interview, 4 days before Mother's Day, was interesting and coincidental in a couple of ways beyond the fact of the 20th anniversary of his handbook. The Unitarian Universalist Church he helped construct is moving into its new home Monday. Furthermore, one of several tales he related involving APBA founder Richard Seitz was one he gave at a convention around Father's Day years ago, but, coincidentally, resonates even more strongly as we honor the women who brought us into this world. "I'm a little punchy right now," Zack explained, saying he hasn't been getting much sleep during the church project. "After 2 years, they're finally moving in. It's a huge volunteer effort. It's just amazing. So I haven't had time to do much APBA. Erecting the new house of worship has been, quote, one of the greatest adventures in my life, end quote. A life during which he has worked with the Red Cross and performed disaster relief work around the world, including Cuba, Bosnia, Tierra del Fuego, and New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. Quote, but building this church is really off the charts, end quote. No matter that discussing APBA was a great diversion from the pressure that I'm under right now, he said, it's just very pleasurable to remember these stories. Quote, the book is a compilation of my attempts to quantify the mystery of the cards in as methodical a way as I could come up with, to identify the cards, to classify the cards, to point out the idiosyncrasies of the cards and the mistakes and errors that have crept in over the years, Zack explained in the 1994 APBA documentary video of Dice and Men by Scott Lahotsky. Nearly 20 years later, Zack again recalled his efforts. It needed to be done, he says. It was just so obvious. First of all, I was fascinated by the cards. I started playing APBA in my 30s. I was just astonished. It just hit me. I love playing games, parlor games, family games, card games, any kind of game, I'll play. But APBA just took me by storm. And then I just got fascinated with the cards, and then there were all these weird things about the cards that just kept piling up. Those cards kept piling up thanks to Dan Armstrong, who introduced Zack to APBA and wrote the foreword to both the first edition in 1992 and the second edition 7 years later. I just started playing this game. To me, it was just a board game like Monopoly, Zack says. But it was fun, and the numbers were just fascinating. And Dan's a real good teacher. And then he kept on pulling out more and more cards. I thought there were only a couple of teams you could play, and he just kept on pulling out more cards from different eras because he had some great teams of the past. And it just blew me away. Then I said, what if I started collecting cards? It was kind of cool. I noticed there were differences, and there were many printings of the 31 A's or the 27 Yankees and the great teams of the past. It was just so different and utterly fascinating to me. For those not familiar with Zack's handbook or who haven't seen it in person, it is a gorgeously crafted and engagingly written encyclopedia that documents just about every baseball team and season set APBA has created since Seitz introduced the game as a refinement of the national pastime game he played as a boy. The book illuminates not only the unique achievements of the players whose performances are reflected in their carefully calculated cards, but the various styles of cards printed throughout the years. The book also features extensive appendices addressing dice-driven baseball board games before APBA, the preservation of the game's vital paper rosters, and guidance on collecting APBA cards by David A. Lawrence. Quote, I at one point had every card that APBA had ever printed, Zack says. There's a total in there somewhere in the back of the book, giving the rough count of them, including the variations. I forgot what it was, 70,000, 100,000, something like that. He even had a special 3-foot by 7-foot card cabinet made to house his collection, his APBA-cus, modeled after the custom storage devices Armstrong had created and named. The cabinet can be seen during Zack's comments in Of Dice and Men. But where is that collection now? I gave it all away, Zack says. As I was writing the second edition, I was going through some personal tragedy, and to get out of where I was, I had to change my whole life. And that meant stop being the expert on the cards for the APBA community. So I appointed a guardian of all that data. It was a significant step for someone who had grown into one of the icons of the game. Ed Zack has put himself in the position of being an official in the APBA community, and I think that may sometimes be more than one would ordinarily want to bite off, Lawrence said in Of Dice and Men. I have no doubt that he receives letters in the mail asking him, in which year did Don Mueller have the most 31s on his card? And Ed Zack, because he's a nice guy and he's devoted to APBA, will actually answer those letters. Research for his handbook took Zack down an extraordinary number of divergent paths and unearthed far more than just a history behind the game introduced in 1951 by J. Richard Seitz. When Seitz died, there was this very complicated family situation, Zack said. Then the people who bought his house started getting rid of Seitz's stuff. Turned out to be Seitz was a pack rat, saved everything. That's when they found the Seitz collection, his personal collection, going back to the original 1950. They were selling it off. Because I was writing the book, I just had this standard offer to them. They would send me a banker's box full of stuff they found, paper and stuff, for $50 a box. And I can't tell you how many dozens. The whole estate was filled with stuff. Now, I still play APBA, but I seldom crack the book. It's such a huge corpus of information, it's hard to remember it all, Zack says. Current APBA owner John Herson is among the many people Zack acknowledged for their assistance with his handbook. Herson is thanked, quote, for proofreading more than his fair share of the chapters, and then still more, and then a few more, on page 5. We spoke briefly about the challenges facing a board game company in the digital age. Quote, we're absolutely a dying breed, Zack says. APBA fit a certain demographic profile, middle class, upper middle class, geeky kids who loved baseball in the heyday of baseball and got addicted to the game because it was the highest technology thing going. What was there? There weren't any electronic games, it was just board games. And this was really cool. Now that demographic is video games, I think the board game will be archaic very soon. Still love it, and I can't imagine not playing APBA, but when I die, there's not going to be another generation to play. Such is the challenge facing the tabletop gaming community today. But Zack can see the attraction in attempting to defy market trends. If I wasn't building the church, if my life hadn't taken the turn it did, I would probably have been interested in doing something with the company, he asserts. It gets in your blood. It's so important. If you're a businessman and you love APBA, it's like an ideal job. You're also like being Site's number 2. You're the new Dick Sites because you're making the cards or making the decision on the cards. As our conversation came to a close so Zack could run to a 6:30 p.m. meeting, he thanked me for our conversation. You just hit the right button, he enthused. And so that's where Ed Zack's mind was in May 2012 regarding APBA Baseball, his handbook, the tabletop sports gaming community at large. A few days later, I reached out to Dan Armstrong, tracked him down probably through the Between the Lines forum. It was a little harder to find folks back then because not everyone was part of a hobbyist page or group on Facebook, and so you had to do maybe a little extra digging, but I did find Dan and kind of surprised him, which you can hear in the audio file. But what I'll do is simply read the transcription of what he and I spoke about regarding how Dan met Edwin and how Dan taught Ed the game of APBA Baseball and how Ed really took it to heart. So, in the words of Dan Armstrong, quote, I met Ed when I first moved to Eugene and I was a graduate student at the University of Oregon and in need of part-time work to make my tuition. So as I recall, I was renting a house from a guy who did remodels. I'm 22, 23 years old, and Ed was one of the guys who worked with this other man, so I met Ed basically on the job. He was a contractor and I was a laborer, and Ned and I hit it off right away. I believe this was in 1973. The way I introduced the game to Ed was that I had quit playing at that point in my life, and I still had a set, and it was probably at my parents' house. I discovered there was a master game in 1976, and I was just curious to see what the master game was. Ed didn't know about the game at this point. I got the master game, and I thought, wow, this is a much improved game, and I wrote home to my mother and told her to send me my cards. I then began infilling back. I had had lots of the years for, 5 or 6 years, and I began to infill and buy the new seasons. This is around 1976 and 77. I still played only alone, and I didn't know anybody else who played. And I think I was living in Portland at the time, and then the next year I moved down to Eugene, and Ed had gotten into playing other types of games for fun. We would play darts or Monopoly or Scrabble or any game we could come up with. Ed was not a huge baseball fan at all when I met him. Out of the blue, I think his brother was visiting him, and I brought the game over and I taught it to Ed and his brother, and we played in a small league. I believe that's in 1977 or 1978. Ed became an immediate advocate of the game. It inspired me to start trying to get some of those older sets. We played for about another 10 years. I think the first thing we did seriously was a replay of 1922, and that really was the ticket. We got a couple of other people to play with us, and toward the end of that process, I began to assemble a notebook because I was starting to get a pretty good collection. I began to assemble a notebook that had all the extraordinary cards listed. There weren't that many people with power numbers on 44, so that was one of the lists I started. Then AC pitchers. I had a very small little notebook, maybe 10 to 15 categories, and I showed it to Ed, and kind of on his own, he started adding more to this. At this point, I was living in Portland, he was living in Eugene, and I would come down for the weekends and we would play games. One weekend I came down and he said, I'm going to do this APBA handbook, and he showed me all this stuff he had put together. I was just blown away and said, okay, well, let's do it. Ed and David Lawrence did a whole lot of the work. I was kind of like the third editor, and I would come down for a weekend and play some games, and Ed would hand me some documents he'd written up, and I'd proofread them and make suggestions. So that first book was really Ed, really concentrating, and I think it came out of our friendship and the games that we played, and his trying to get a better grasp on the game. For better or worse, I tended to win most of the games. I'd played it longer and knew it better, and I also was more of a baseball nut than Ed was. He was really learning baseball through the game. Now that's just an incredible story to me. And that's kind of the power of this hobby. And whatever game engine, whatever platform you prefer, it hit you that certain way. And it certainly hit Ed Zack. And his passion was such that we have two incredible volumes and now the digital version of his handbook. I have lucky to have both versions, print version 1 and 2. And I'll just read you the introduction letter from the 1992 first edition by Edwin Zack of Eugene, Oregon. Dear APBA Baseball fan, thank you for your purchase of the handbook for APBA Baseball cards. I hope you enjoy reading the book as much as I did creating it. I consider this book an ongoing research process into the magic of APBA baseball cards. My literary skin is very thick, therefore I welcome criticism, additions, corrections, and new research projects from the APBA community. One possible project is the inputting of all 45,000 APBA cards into a computer database. Obviously, a task of this magnitude would require several co-workers. Anyone interested in becoming involved, please contact me. Your suggestions and feedback are welcome. In line with this, I still am assembling an information base of cards. Enclosed is a list of cards that I still am missing in my collection and would appreciate any help or leads in tracking them down. Conversely, I have accumulated a substantial number of duplicates which are available to those who need to infill their collections. A second list of duplicate items is enclosed. Again, thank you for your interest and support. So there, again, is the seed of another innovation, really, the card bank. The collection of cards that people will share with one another so everyone can get as close to complete sets of whatever seasons they're looking for. Of course, eventually we had Jack Cohn, who became the card father, who would help folks fill in their collections. Rich Prey has become the card father too, and you've got Wade Coble running an APBA baseball card bank. So from that ripple that Ed Zack sent out has been born many, many great projects helping the APBA community over the years. And if you open the 92 version of the book here, you'll see that all player cards reproduced with permission of the APBA Game Company. It's interesting as you read the introduction and credits for the 1999 Ultimate Handbook that all player cards reproduced with permission of Ablesoft Inc. So the decade of some turmoil there, but the second version of the book is it's even got the rounded corners on the right side of the cover so that you've got that APBA feel. This version has a Brooklyn 1953 senior circuit, probably a sample card in here, and it's just you don't even have to like the game of baseball, really, to just be amazed at the level of work here. Let's just look at the 67 Boston Red Sox, great team of the past, number 50 on page 523. The card pictured is that of Anthony Richard Koenig Canigliaro of Revere, Mass. The team has 20 cards. It's the D format per the specs that they've set out in the book. Published in 1981. The back is the number 1 variant, and the 12 is on 41, and it's print style number 4. So certainly, as if you're a typography geek or an aesthetics geek, this is yet another fascination with the book. And here's the blurb on the set. Quote, as a local boy made good, Tony was one of the most popular Red Sox of all time. He had an aggressive style of hitting that reminds one of Jack Clark in his prime. When he was felled by a Jack Hamilton pitch in August 1967, he was on his way to his best season ever. Amazingly, he was able to come back and have another big year in 1970, but from that point forward, his health went into rapid decline. Miscellany for this set. The envelope for this team has Boston/Red Sox/of/1967 on it. The roster is printed on pink or orange cardstock, 2.5 inches by 3.5 inches with rounded corners. That's your APBA card right there, 2.5 by 3.5. Now, as I said earlier, I did not become aware of the Ed Zack book until buying some of the Robert Henry collection from Mr. Pete Simonelli, who's fairly close to me in New Jersey, and he regaled me with the tales of the Zack handbook and the of Dice and Men documentary of the APBA community, and needless to say, I was blown away. I immediately started an APBA football handbook. So the APBA football handbook, as I envision it, will duplicate in every possible way the APBA baseball book of Ed Zack. There are so many ways to present NFL history and juxtapose it with how you play the game. I'd really advise anyone to look at the Zack handbook online. And if anyone would like to see the current state, it's very small, of the APBA football handbook that I've been putting together, I welcome that. We do own all the original season sets through to the 2000s, and we're slowly building our more current collection, also including all the reprints. An undertaking like this is no mean task. Now, on the zackappahandbook.org website, if you click on the handbook, there's a great photo from the famous 2006 Handbook Committee meeting in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and some of the faces you'll see there, well, there's Mr. Mark Rinaldi, former APBA president. There's Mr. Robert Henry, front and center. There's Mr. Eric Naftali, the last editor of the APBA Journal. There's Mr. Zack himself in the front. And there's Mr. Dave Urban and Mr. John Cochran behind him and some other folks there. It's just a testament to how one man's vision inspired so many other folks, and we'll continue to draw inspiration from Mr. Zack's words. And in fact, we'll leave off with another tale of his regarding his Father's Day presentation at an APBA convention past. We will continue to draw daily inspiration from Mr. Zack and his APBA baseball handbook. I know several folks said they would be honoring the man by revisiting the book over the past couple of days as tributes are pouring in and remembrances. His work really stands as a testament to the power these games have to inspire, to fuel the imagination. Please do yourself a favor and check out zackappahandbook.org and give a little personal thanks to a man who documented a significant portion of our mutual obsession.
It was one of the conventions, and it was a Saturday, and because I put out the book, they wanted me to give the speech on Saturday. As I'm waiting on stage for Scott Lahotsky, he's standing there to introduce me, and he says, "You're on next. Good luck. Tomorrow's Father's Day. Happy Father's Day." And as I was walking on stage, I took the notes that I had on the cards in the book that I was going to give, and I threw them in the garbage can. And I walked up to the dais and I said, "Hi, I'm Ed Zack, and I'm here to give a talk about APBA cards and APBA baseball. But I don't want to do that. I want to talk about fatherhood." And I spent 20 minutes talking about fatherhood to a bunch of beer belly, dice throwing, backwards capped guys. And there were guys crying. And when I tried to stop, because it was, I'm there to give it, they said, "No, keep going. This is the community you're sharing with, that you're part of, that is incredibly accepting and willing to go deeper than just throwing dice on a table." It's a tremendously humane, and I use the word advisor, a loving community, a very supportive community. It struck me, again, it happened in a split second when Scott Lahotsky said, "Happy Father's Day," that all these strands, these very complicated strands of fatherhood and paternity that were like the background to the whole. I mean, just the fact that Seitz really wasn't the father of the game. There was all this tangled stuff that for some reason I needed. For me, this is selfish of me, but it just came out of me. That none of this was planned or anything. Literally, I had my notes for the talk I was going to give, but somehow this just Father's Day just needed to be acknowledged among all of us who always have father issues. The willingness of the community to absorb this strange guy talking weird stuff was. I look back at that with absolute awe that you guys endured that. So thank you.